I had always been drawn to the outdoors, to the quiet, the peace, the solitude that came with being away from everything. That's why I had chosen to spend my weekend hiking in the woods alone. I knew it would be a challenge, but something about the thought of being out there, away from the noise of daily life, was something I couldn't resist. So, I packed my gear, checked the weather, and set off with a sense of excitement. The sun had barely risen when I reached the trailhead. The early morning fog hung thick in the air, weaving through the trees like a shroud. I could smell the damp earth, the crispness of the pine trees, and the fresh scent of the morning dew. It was everything I had hoped for. The world was still, quiet, and I had it all to myself. The trail was easy to follow at first, winding through thick forest, the ground soft beneath my boots. I had planned on a 3-day hike with camping along the way. I had everything I needed: food, water, a tent, sleeping bag, and a small stove. I felt ready. I thought I was ready. As the hours passed, the trail seemed to narrow, the trees growing taller and denser. The quiet of the woods was both soothing and unsettling. Every so often, a distant bird call or the rustle of a squirrel in the leaves would break the silence. But for the most part, it was just me, the path, and the woods around me. I wasn't really sure where I was going. I hadn't looked at a map in hours, just following the trail as it wound deeper into the forest. I had been out here plenty of times before, so I wasn't worried. But the deeper I went, the less familiar everything started to feel. The trail began to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember. There were no markings, no signs, and no landmarks. Just trees, rocks, and more trees. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had lost track of time. The sun was no longer visible through the canopy above, the sky a murky gray, as if it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The air was cooler now, and I was starting to feel the weight of my pack on my back. I decided to stop and set up camp before it got too dark. I found a small clearing near a stream, the sound of the water a comforting presence as I set up my tent. The ground was soft, and the spot was sheltered enough to block the wind. I got my stove going and ate a simple dinner of canned chili. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The sound of the crackling wood was the only noise now. Night fell quickly in the woods, and with it, a deep, eerie silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I sat there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, but eventually, I went inside my tent, zipping it up and lying down on the sleeping bag. At first, I thought I heard something. Just a faint rustle of leaves, too subtle to be a squirrel or any of the other forest creatures I was used to. I brushed it off, but the noise came again, this time a little louder, closer. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to remain calm. It was just an animal, probably a deer or something. I heard it again, and this time I knew it wasn't just an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too methodical, as though something was moving on purpose. I sat up in my tent, straining my ears, the darkness around me feeling like it was closing in. The wind had picked up slightly, but it didn't explain the noise. There was something out there, something large. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the dark. I shined it out of the tent, scanning the area. Nothing. The clearing was empty, save for the trees and the stream. I exhaled, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Maybe it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me. But then the noise came again, this time closer. It sounded like something heavy, moving through the brush, slowly, carefully. My heart began to pound in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear or a moose, but the sound was too controlled, too purposeful. It wasn't just moving around, it was circling me. I lay back down in my sleeping bag, pulling the covers up tight, forcing myself to breathe deeply and calmly. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It felt like whatever was out there was waiting for something, and the longer I lay there, the more that feeling intensified. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, feel the sweat on the back of my neck, and my mind raced through all sorts of possibilities. Eventually, the sound stopped. For a while, I didn't hear anything at all, and I convinced myself it had just been my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Couldn't fall asleep. I kept my flashlight on, lying in the darkness, listening, waiting, but nothing happened. The night passed in restless silence. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to move on. The woods felt different now, like they were hiding something I couldn't see. I followed the trail again, trying to shake the unease from my mind. I couldn't tell if the air was thicker, or if I was just imagining it. The trees loomed above me, their branches interwoven like fingers, blocking out the sky. The trail had become narrower, overgrown, like no one had been down it in years. By midday, I realized I hadn't seen a single sign of other hikers. No footprints, no litter, no signs of human presence at all. It was just me, alone in the wilderness. And the deeper I went, the more I felt that unease settle in my gut. I stopped at a small creek to refill my water bottle, and as I knelt down, I noticed something strange. There was a trail of broken branches, as if something had been dragged through the forest. The trail didn't seem natural, like an animal's path. It was too neat, too deliberate. My heart rate quickened as I followed the broken branches with my eyes. The trail led off the main path, deeper into the woods, away from the creek. The curiosity gnawed at me, but a part of me, a much smarter part, told me to turn back. It was probably nothing, just an old fallen tree or some debris, but I couldn't let it go. Something about it felt wrong. So I followed the trail. It wasn't far before I found what I was looking for. A small, abandoned campsite. There was a fire pit, still warm, and scattered around it were the remains of food wrappers, bits of old clothing, and a half-crushed sleeping pad. The tent was ripped open, torn as if something had forced its way out. I stood frozen for a moment, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Who had camped here, and why had they left so suddenly? I moved closer to the fire pit, feeling my pulse quicken. There was a faint smell lingering in the air, a sour, metallic scent I couldn't quite place. I leaned down to examine the ground and found something that made my blood run cold. Deep, fresh gouges in the earth, as if something had been dragged across the campsite. I stepped back quickly, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. The forest didn't feel like the peaceful escape it had been when I first arrived. It felt hostile, like something was waiting. I retraced my steps, back toward the trail. My mind was spinning, but I tried to focus on the path, trying to calm myself. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, as I picked up my pace. The forest had grown thicker again, the trees closing in on me. I didn't know how long I'd been walking when I finally found a familiar marker, a small rock outcrop I recognized. I was getting closer to the trailhead. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Something moved in the corner of my vision, just out of reach of the flashlight's beam. It was fast, too fast for a human, and it darted behind a tree. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stood there, paralyzed with fear. The thing in the forest was still there, watching me. The minutes stretched on, but I knew I had to move. So I ran. I ran as fast as I could, the trees blurring past me. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, until I was back at my car, breathing heavily, my chest tight with panic. I didn't know who or what had left that campsite behind, or what had been circling my tent that night, but I wasn't going back. I didn't care how many trails I had yet to explore. I was done with that forest. The woods, once a place of quiet escape, had shown me something I couldn't unsee, something far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. I never told anyone what happened, but I've never gone hiking alone again. The trail might be there, waiting for someone else to wander down it, but I've learned my lesson. Some paths are better left untaken. I had never really been much of a camping person. Sure, I'd spent a few nights in the woods when I was younger, but nothing that would leave a lasting impression. But when my friend Josh suggested we take a weekend trip into the wilderness to disconnect and do some fishing, I didn't think twice. It sounded simple enough. Just a couple of guys, a tent, some fishing gear, and maybe a little whiskey by the campfire. What could go wrong? The plan was straightforward. We'd drive up to a remote spot in the mountains, set up camp near a river, and spend 2 nights out there. I'd heard a few rumors about the area. It wasn't exactly a hot spot for tourists, which was part of the draw for Josh. He liked the idea of being away from people, away from noise, and far from the distractions of the city. It wasn't like we were hiking deep into the backcountry or anything. We'd have access to a dirt road, and there were enough signs pointing the way to let us know we weren't completely off the grid. We arrived late in the afternoon on the first day. The drive had taken longer than expected. The air was thick with the scent of pine and fresh earth, and the sunlight was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land. It was exactly what we had been hoping for. Isolated, quiet, peaceful. Josh jumped out of the truck, excited as ever, and immediately started unloading gear. I was a bit slower to follow. My nerves, which I hadn't even realized were building up, started to settle in. I had never been a fan of complete isolation. As much as I enjoyed nature, the idea of being out in the wilderness with no one around for miles did make me uneasy. But I kept those thoughts to myself. Josh didn't exactly have a lot of patience for that kind of talk. He was always about embracing the adventure, no matter how extreme. We set up the tent quickly, the sun hanging just low enough to give the campsite a golden hue. The river was only a few yards away, and the sound of running water was soothing. I could already tell that the next couple of days were going to be quieter than I was used to, and maybe that was exactly what I needed. That first night, everything felt fine. We cooked a simple meal over the fire, chatted about nothing in particular, and cracked open a couple of beers. The night air grew colder, and we sat around the fire, the only light for miles, watching the flames flicker in the dark. The forest was alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in the wind, and the occasional distant howl of a coyote reminded us that we weren't the only creatures out there. By the time we crawled into the tent and settled in for the night, I was exhausted. I remember feeling a strange sense of calm, like I could finally relax after weeks of city noise and pressure. The sound of the river running nearby was like a lullaby, and soon, I drifted off to sleep. It wasn't until the middle of the night that things started to feel off. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there in the darkness, listening. The air had gotten colder, the fire long since reduced to embers. The silence was thick now, more oppressive than the usual night sounds. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. No chirping, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest itself had gone quiet. For a moment, I thought it was just the effect of waking up in a new environment. But then I heard something very faint, but definitely there. A noise just at the edge of my hearing. It sounded like something moving in the underbrush, maybe a large animal, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. It wasn't the typical shuffle of a deer or the scurry of a small animal. It was deliberate, almost slow. I sat up in the tent, my heart racing a little faster than it should have been. I could hear Josh's steady breathing beside me, and for a second, I thought maybe I was imagining things. But then the noise came again, closer this time. It was hard to explain, but there was something wrong with it. It wasn't just the sound of something moving in the forest. It felt like something was being careful, like it was trying to avoid making noise, but still making it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I reached for my flashlight, carefully trying not to wake Josh. I didn't want to freak him out over nothing, but my instincts were telling me that something was off. When I flicked the beam of light out of the tent, I half expected to see an animal standing at the edge of the trees, staring at us. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty woods. I laid back down, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves. There was no reason to be paranoid. It was probably just some nocturnal animal going about its business. But the noise kept me awake for a while longer. And eventually, just when I thought I might drift back to sleep, it stopped. The next morning, Josh was already up, poking at the remnants of the fire from last night. The sun was creeping over the trees, and the first rays of light cast long, stretched shadows across the forest floor. "Sleep okay?" he asked, glancing over at me with a grin. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I just nodded and got out of the tent. I didn't mention the noise. It wasn't like there was anything to report, just my overactive imagination at work, right? We spent the day fishing by the river, and the quiet of the area felt more comforting than unsettling. The stillness of the place had a certain peace to it, and as the hours passed, the unease I had felt the night before seemed to melt away. We caught a few fish, not much, but enough to keep us occupied. The sun beat down on us, and the whole day passed in a blur of simple tasks, the steady sound of the river in the background. But as the sun began to set that second night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong again. Josh was off fishing near a bend in the river, and I had returned to camp to make sure the fire was going strong before it got too dark. The whole area felt eerily still, almost too still. It was as though the forest had returned to that same dead silence I had experienced the night before. The fire crackled and popped, sending a few embers into the air, but that was the only sound. It was so quiet that I started listening for even the smallest noises, anything to break the thick silence. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the trees, but other than that, there was nothing. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It wasn't a large animal, nor was it a shadow cast by the fire. It was subtle, a flicker of movement just past the tree line. I froze, staring in that direction. For a moment, I thought it was Josh coming back. But no, he was still across the river. The thing that caught my eye wasn't big, just a flash of movement, almost too quick to notice. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It was almost like the figure of a person, but it didn't move like one. It was too fluid, too unnatural, slipping behind the trees like it was trying to avoid being seen. Panic gripped my chest as I slowly stood up. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. A person out here, alone, at the edge of the woods would be unusual, but not impossible. But this didn't feel right. Whoever or whatever was out there was taking pains to stay hidden, and that made it even worse. I grabbed the pocket knife from my bag, the cold metal reassuring in my hand. I didn't know what I was expecting, but my senses were on high alert now. I told myself it was probably just a lost hiker or someone else camping in the area, but my gut told me otherwise. It was quiet again, the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums. I strained to hear any sound, but there was nothing. No crunch of leaves, no movement in the underbrush. Just the silence, the kind of silence that presses in and makes you feel like you're being watched. I had always thought I was tough when it came to camping. I had spent years backpacking through the woods, sleeping under the stars, and braving the elements, all by myself. But this trip, this one was different. I had decided to hike up Cedar Peak, a spot I'd heard about from a friend who had done the same trip a few years back. He told me it was peaceful, remote, and the perfect escape from the bustle of daily life. That sounded like exactly what I needed after the last few months. The plan was simple. I'd hike in, set up camp, and spend the night under the canopy of trees before heading back the next morning. Nothing major, just a solo trip for some time to think. I had all the gear I'd need: a small tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, and a map of the trail. It seemed straightforward enough. The trailhead was just a little over an hour's drive from the nearest town, tucked away on a quiet dirt road. As soon as I parked my car and stepped out, the weight of the quiet hit me. There wasn't a single sound beyond the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was like the world had just paused. I could already feel the tension from the past few weeks slipping away. I adjusted the straps on my backpack and started walking. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees, and the ground was covered with pine needles and fallen leaves. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude, listening to nothing but the sound of my footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The smell of damp earth filled the air, and everything was calm. Too calm, I thought to myself, but I didn't let it bother me. It was just the peace of the wilderness, after all. I checked my map once or twice along the way, making sure I was on the right path. The hike was easy, with only a few minor inclines, but I could tell it was going to take a while to get to the peak. The sun had begun to sink lower in the sky by the time I reached the halfway point, where the trail split. One path veered off to the left, heading into deeper, darker woods. The other continued straight, following the natural contours of the land toward the summit. I decided to take the straight path. The sun would set soon, and I wanted to set up camp before dark. As I walked, the light began to fade, and the shadows grew longer. A chill settled in the air, even though the day had been warm. I zipped up my jacket and quickened my pace. It wasn't that I felt scared, not exactly, but something about the silence was unsettling. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. The trees grew denser, and the trail became more uneven. I began to feel like I was being watched. It was a strange sensation, like someone or something was just out of sight, moving with me. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I felt that nagging sense of eyes on my back. But when I turned around, there was nothing there, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. The thought of turning back crossed my mind briefly, but I pushed it away. I was almost there. By the time I reached the campsite at the top of the hill, the sun was nearly gone. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, and the last of the daylight was slipping away. The clearing was small but sheltered by thick trees, offering a perfect spot for my tent. I set up quickly, the sound of my tent poles clicking together loud in the stillness. As I finished setting up, I started a small fire. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat back on my pack, enjoying the warmth, but that nagging feeling didn't go away. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every time the wind picked up, I swore I heard something moving in the trees. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just the wind. I had a simple dinner, some dried pasta with a little bit of sauce, nothing fancy, and ate in silence, listening to the crackling of the fire. As I ate, I couldn't help but notice the quiet. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet I had expected. It was the silence of a place that was empty, like the forest had emptied itself of everything but the trees and the shadows. The fire seemed to flicker a little too much for my liking, and I kept adding logs, not wanting it to die down. Felt like the dark was closing in. As the night grew darker, the moon barely visible behind the canopy of leaves, I went inside the tent, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the rustling again. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something moving in the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the noise persisted, growing louder, closer. I laid there in the dark, eyes wide open, listening intently, trying to tell myself it was just an animal or maybe a branch swaying in the breeze. But it wasn't. It was deliberate. Someone or something was moving in the woods, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I could hear it circling around me, getting closer, then moving away again. I waited and waited. It didn't stop. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and unzipped the tent carefully, trying not to make a sound. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. I stepped out into the clearing, the beam of the flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing. The forest was still, too still. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but there was nothing, just shadows. I was about to step back inside when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker, a figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the tree line. My heart nearly stopped. The figure was tall, shadowy, and it moved quickly, darting between the trees before disappearing into the darkness. I froze, my blood running cold. That wasn't an animal. It wasn't even a person. It was something else entirely. I bolted back into the tent and zipped it up, my mind racing. I wasn't alone up here. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were watching, waiting. I spent the next few hours lying there, wide awake, my mind spiraling. The rustling continued, and every time I thought I might drift off, I heard something moving again. It never stopped, not once. By the time the first light of dawn touched the sky, I hadn't slept a wink. My entire body was on edge, and the exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk whatever was out there getting any closer. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing my gear into my bag without paying attention to how neatly I packed it. I just wanted to get out of there. The whole hike back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, made my heart jump. When I finally reached the car, I felt like I had just escaped something. I threw my bag into the trunk, slammed the door, and drove away, not looking back once. I never went back to Cedar Peak. To this day, I still don't know what I saw out there. But I know one thing for sure: some places are better left unexplored. It had been weeks since I'd been out camping. The kind of camping where you go off the beaten path, away from the crowds, and into the heart of the woods. I'd needed that. Needed to escape from the noise of the world, the constant distractions, the reminders of everything waiting for me back home. Work, bills, relationships. They all seemed like a distant memory when I was out there, surrounded by nothing but the deep green of the trees, the scent of pine and earth, and the sound of a babbling stream running somewhere nearby. I'd chosen a remote spot this time, far from any marked trails. The plan was simple: hike in, set up camp, and spend a few nights alone. Just me and the forest. It wasn't far from the town I'd grown up in, but I hadn't been back here in years. It felt strange at first, returning to familiar land that had long been forgotten, but the feeling of familiarity quickly faded once I was deep enough into the forest. The air had a bite to it that told me autumn was fast approaching, and the ground was still damp from a rainstorm a couple of days before. The smell of wet soil mixed with the rich pine scent as I set up my tent and unfurled my sleeping bag. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, I knew I had to make my first real decision. I had to start a fire. I wasn't one to trust modern camping equipment all that much. No fancy stoves or portable grills for me. I wanted to do things the old way. I found a small patch of flat rock near the edge of the clearing and began gathering dry kindling and small logs. By the time the fire was crackling and sending shadows dancing across the trees, I was already comfortable. The fire, though not large, threw enough warmth to take the chill from the evening air. The distant calls of owls and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush were the only sounds, and I felt content, completely alone in the world. A quiet solitude that only deepened when the last light of day disappeared, and the sky above turned an impenetrable black. Night fell quickly. I ate a simple meal of trail mix and jerky, enjoying the solitude of the forest even more as the darkness deepened. The light from the fire gave the trees around me an eerie glow. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving just outside the reach of the firelight. A trick of the eyes, I told myself. But as the night wore on, that feeling stuck with me, a sensation that I wasn't truly alone. I shoved the thought away, focusing on the fire and the comforting crackling sound it made. The warmth from the fire felt good, but the cold air crept up behind me, slipping in around the edges of my jacket. I pulled my coat tighter and settled into the camp chair I'd brought, letting my gaze wander to the edge of the clearing where the trees began to thicken. The forest was dense, the kind of place that made you feel small, could hide secrets, things that you could never know. The deep silence that blanketed the forest made everything feel more intense, more real. Hours passed. The moon climbed high above the trees, casting a dim light on the forest floor. The fire had died down a little, leaving only glowing embers. I had no real plans for the night, but the feeling that I wasn't alone in this place began to gnaw at me again. I told myself it was just the natural unease of being so far from civilization, but something in the air told me there was more to it. It wasn't just the silence or the stillness. It was something else. I stood up, stretched my legs, and decided to take a quick walk around the clearing, hoping the movement would shake off the tension. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and moved toward the trees, sweeping the beam of light across the ground, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The forest was still, but it felt different now, like it was holding its breath, watching me. The beam of light caught something in the distance. It was too far for me to make out, but it looked like someone moving just past the trees. My heart thudded in my chest. I froze, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. I couldn't tell for sure. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature. I told myself it was nothing, but even then, a strange chill ran down my spine. I turned back toward the camp. That's when I noticed something strange. The fire had shifted. The logs were no longer where I'd left them. Some of them had been knocked out of place, and the flames had shifted in a way that suggested someone had been there, messing with it. My stomach dropped. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to secure the firewood properly, but I quickly realized that couldn't be it. I was certain of where I'd stacked everything, and there was no reason why the fire should have changed on its own. My eyes darted to the trees again, the sense that I was being watched creeping up my back like a cold hand. The rustling I'd heard earlier didn't seem as innocent now. I wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever was out there, they knew I was here. I grabbed my pack, ready to call it a night and retreat to the safety of my tent. But that's when I heard it again. A crack of a twig breaking, but this time closer. The hairs on my neck stood up as I turned toward the sound. I couldn't see anything, just the black shapes of the trees looming in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. I had to get back to the tent. Now, I hurried back to the camp, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath me. I didn't want to run, but the feeling of being hunted pressed down on me, and every fiber of my being told me to move faster. When I reached the fire, I didn't even stop to check the logs again. I just grabbed my stuff and shoved it into the backpack, keeping my eyes on the dark edges of the clearing. I darted into the tent and zipped it up tightly, my heart racing in my chest. The night outside seemed too quiet now, too still. I lay there in the dark, listening, waiting. The only sound was the distant wind moving through the trees, but that couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Hours passed. The unease wouldn't leave. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept a wink. The unease had only grown. I knew I couldn't stay out here any longer. The forest wasn't safe, not in the way I thought it would be. It had taken on a different character, and I wasn't willing to take any more chances. Packing up my gear as quickly as possible, I stayed alert, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The sun was still low, casting long shadows, and the forest felt completely different now in the morning light. I didn't know what had happened last night, or what I had felt, but I wasn't sticking around to figure it out. I wanted to leave, wanted to get out of that place as fast as I could. By the time I'd packed everything up, I barely looked back at the campsite. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, or if I'd seen anything at all, but the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered, and I wasn't about to stick around long enough to test that feeling further. As I hiked back out of the woods, the uneasy sensation didn't fade. It only grew stronger. It was like the forest had taken something from me, something I couldn't name. The further I walked, the more I realized that the sound of my boots crunching on the trail was the only thing keeping me grounded. There was no rustling, no strange noises, just me and the quiet. I reached the edge of the woods just as the sun was fully rising, and the moment I stepped out into the open, I felt the weight lift. The air was different here, lighter, freer. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't coming back. The forest had a way of making you feel like you were alone, but deep down I knew better. Something had been out there with me, something that knew I was there, and it hadn't been an animal. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the wilderness, the kind of stillness that only a few miles of hiking and a couple of hours from the nearest road could offer. I'd been on plenty of camping trips before, but this time felt different, almost too quiet. Maybe it was because I was alone, or maybe it was because I had chosen a more remote spot than usual, a place that wasn't marked on the maps I had brought along. I was used to the typical trails, but this was something else. The hike in had been peaceful, but it wasn't long before I began to feel a shift in the air. As I set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, there was an odd sense of being watched, although I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the isolation of being so far from anyone else. Still, I kept my senses alert as I gathered firewood and started a small fire. The night came quickly, the sun sinking behind the trees and casting long shadows across the ground. I sat by the fire, the crackling with the only sound breaking the silence of the forest. I was used to the noises of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig from some unseen animal. But tonight, there was something different. A strange stillness had fallen over everything. The firelight flickered, and I stared into the dancing flames. I felt the weight of the darkness around me, thick and heavy. It wasn't the kind of darkness that felt comfortable, like a peaceful night in the woods. It was oppressive, as if something was out there, waiting. I could hear every movement, every rustle of the trees, but there was no animal sound, no wind stirring the branches. It was all too quiet. I decided to go to bed early, hoping the next day would bring some relief. My tent was simple, just a small two-person model that would keep the bugs out and protect me from the elements. I crawled inside, zipped up the entrance, and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind drifted back to the stillness outside, the unsettling quiet. Hours passed, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me, but rather a feeling. The same feeling that had nagged at me earlier, the sense of being watched. I lay still, my breath shallow, listening intently. Outside, the night was still. No wind, no animals, nothing. And then I heard it, a soft thud, like something heavy falling to the ground. It was distant, but it was unmistakable. My heart rate quickened. I had no idea what it could have been, but my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just a branch breaking in the trees, or maybe something had knocked over a rock. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. It was too deliberate, too intentional. I lay there for a long time, frozen, listening for any sign of movement. The forest outside my tent was as quiet as ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made the noise was still out there. My thoughts spiraled. Was it another camper? Maybe someone had gotten lost? But why would they be so close to my camp? And why hadn't they made any other noise? I tried to calm myself, but it was useless. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. My fingers curled into fists at my sides, and my breathing became shallow as I waited. Seconds felt like minutes, and minutes felt like hours. I couldn't move. I didn't want to make any noise, any sudden movement that might draw attention. The noise came again, closer this time. A soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something brushing against the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear it. Something large was out there, moving around my camp. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I knew that much. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, trying to control my panic, trying to think. Should I call out? Should I make a noise to show whoever or whatever it was that I was awake? No, that was the worst idea I could think of. I couldn't let whoever was out there know I was scared. I couldn't let them know I was alone. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag, my hands trembling, and slowly, carefully, I turned it on. The beam sliced through the darkness of the tent, and for a moment, I thought I heard a rustle just outside. I held my breath, trying to listen, but the sound stopped. The forest was still again, too still. What felt like hours passed before I finally summoned the courage to unzip the tent slightly. Just a crack. I needed to see if there was someone or something outside. I held the flashlight up, shining it through the opening. There was nothing. The fire was still burning, the glowing embers casting an eerie light across the clearing, but no sign of movement. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. My heart still raced, but I convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe I had imagined the noises. Maybe the wind had played tricks on me, or a falling branch had caused the sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. After what seemed like forever, I closed the tent flap and tried to sleep again. But sleep didn't come. The hours dragged on, and the night felt like it would never end. Finally, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. The forest, once dark and menacing, now seemed almost peaceful in the light of day. The birds began to sing, the air was fresher, and I allowed myself a deep breath. I sat up in my sleeping bag, stretching and trying to shake off the tension that had gripped me throughout the night. As I stood and stepped out of the tent, I felt a strange sense of relief. The sun was rising, and I had survived the night. But as I looked around, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The campfire was still burning, but the logs were now scattered, as if someone or something had kicked them. The small pile of firewood I had gathered earlier was gone, and there were strange marks in the dirt, long and deep, as if something had dragged its feet across the ground. And then I saw it. A footprint. A large footprint, made in the dirt near the edge of my campsite. It was too big to be a human footprint, and it didn't match any animal tracks I recognized. It was as if something had been walking around my tent, circling me while I slept. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and scanned the area. There was no sign of anyone nearby, but I wasn't sure I wanted to look too closely. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my hands shaking with nervous energy. The noises of the night, the marks in the dirt, the strange feeling of being watched. It all pointed to something far more unsettling than I wanted to admit. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in these woods. Not truly. I hiked out of that clearing faster than I had hiked in. The sun was fully up by the time I reached the main trail, and the forest around me seemed to breathe a little easier, though the unease that had gripped me the night before stayed with me. I told myself I had been overthinking it. Maybe I had just let my mind wander too far into paranoia. But even as I walked back to civilization, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting. And even now, as I sit back at home, the memory of those strange marks in the dirt, the eerie stillness of the night, and the feeling of being followed keeps creeping into my thoughts. I can't help but wonder if the woods still hold whatever it was that circled my camp that night. And if it's out there, maybe, just maybe, it's still waiting.